This bear cub was raised by 3 dogs and thinks he's a dog. What happened next was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The morning sun painted the valley in shades of gold, casting long shadows across the weathered farmhouse where Caleb Hartwell lived alone with his 3 dogs. He'd been running this place for nearly 15 years now, ever since his father passed and left him the sprawling property that bordered the Cascade Mountains. The isolation never bothered him much. He had Rex, a German shepherd with intelligent brown eyes, Bella, a golden retriever whose tail never stopped wagging, and Scout, a border collie who seemed to read his thoughts before he even spoke them. But this morning felt different. Caleb stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching something that still made him shake his head in disbelief even after 6 months. There, rolling in the grass with his 3 dogs, was a bear cub. Not just any bear cub, but one who seemed convinced he was a dog himself. The cub, whom Caleb had named Bruno, was trying to bark at a butterfly that had landed on Scout's nose. The sound that came out was more of a strangled wheeze than anything resembling a proper bark, but Bruno seemed proud of his effort. He wagged his stubby tail and pounced on Bella, who responded by gently rolling him over with her paw. "I still can't believe this is real," Caleb muttered to himself, taking another sip of his coffee. It had started on a cold February night when he'd heard whimpering outside his door. He'd expected to find an injured dog, maybe a stray, looking for shelter. Instead, he'd discovered a bear cub, no bigger than a house cat, shivering and crying for his mother. The cub couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, his eyes barely open, fur matted with snow and dirt. Caleb had spent hours that night debating what to do. He knew he should call wildlife services, knew that raising a wild animal was both dangerous and probably illegal. But something about the tiny creature's desperate cries had broken through all his practical thoughts. The nearest wildlife center was 3 hours away, and with a blizzard warning in effect, the roads were impassable. So he'd brought the cub inside, wrapped him in warm blankets, and tried to feed him with a bottle meant for puppies. The 3 dogs had been curious but gentle, sniffing the newcomer and then settling down around him as if they'd always known he belonged there. Now, watching Bruno attempt to chase his own tail just like Scout did every morning, Caleb wondered if he'd made the right choice. The cub had grown from the size of a house cat to roughly that of a medium-sized dog, his black fur thick and glossy, his movements becoming more coordinated each day. But he showed no signs of behaving like a bear. Instead, he copied everything the dogs did. When Rex barked at strangers, Bruno tried to bark too. When Bella fetched sticks, Bruno would grab one end and play tug-of-war. When Scout herded the chickens, Bruno would waddle behind him, occasionally tumbling over his own paws, but always getting back up with determined enthusiasm. The most remarkable thing, though, was how the dogs had accepted him. They groomed him, shared their food, and included him in all their games. At night, all 4 animals would pile together on the large dog bed Caleb had placed near the fireplace, Bruno nestled safely between his adopted siblings. Caleb finished his coffee and headed down to the yard. As soon as Bruno saw him approaching, the cub abandoned his attempt to dig a hole like Rex and came bounding over. His gait was still clumsy, more of a rolling waddle than the smooth lope of his canine friends, but his excitement was unmistakable. "Morning, buddy," Caleb said, kneeling down to scratch behind Bruno's ears. The cub leaned into the touch, making a sound that was half purr, half whine. "What kind of trouble are you planning to get into today?" Bruno responded by grabbing Caleb's shoelace in his teeth and tugging playfully. Bella trotted over and nudged the cub away from Caleb's foot, then picked up a tennis ball and dropped it at Caleb's feet. Within seconds, all 4 animals were arranged in a semicircle, waiting expectantly for their morning game of fetch. This was their routine now, and it had become as natural as breathing. Caleb would throw the ball. Rex would race after it with his long legs eating up the distance. Bella would bound alongside him with pure joy. Scout would try to anticipate where the ball would land and position himself accordingly, and Bruno would lumber after all of them, usually arriving at the spot just as one of the dogs was already bringing the ball back. But Bruno never seemed discouraged by always being last. He would pant happily, his pink tongue lolling out just like his adoptive siblings, and wait for the next throw with the same eager anticipation. As Caleb threw the ball for the 5th time that morning, he noticed something that made him pause. A figure was standing at the tree line about 50 yards away, watching them. At first, he thought it might be his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who sometimes walked her property line in the early morning. But as his eyes adjusted to the distance, he realized the figure was too large, too broad, and moving in a way that was distinctly non-human. A chill ran down his spine as recognition hit him. It was an adult black bear, and it was staring directly at their little group with an intensity that made Caleb's mouth go dry. The bear was massive, easily 3 times Bruno's size, with thick dark fur that seemed to absorb the morning sunlight. Its powerful shoulders moved slightly as it shifted its weight, never taking its eyes off the playing animals. Caleb's heart began to pound as he realized the dogs and Bruno hadn't noticed the visitor yet. They were still focused on their game, completely unaware of the potential danger lurking at the forest's edge. Caleb tried to keep his movements slow and casual as he reached for the whistle he always kept around his neck. His father had taught him years ago that sudden movements around wild animals could trigger an attack response. But before he could bring the whistle to his lips, something unexpected happened. The adult bear let out a low, rumbling call. It wasn't the aggressive roar Caleb had been dreading, but something softer, almost questioning. The sound carried across the yard like a deep musical note, and suddenly all 4 animals froze. Rex's ears perked up immediately, his body tensing into the alert stance Caleb had seen countless times when the dog sensed something unusual. Bella dropped the tennis ball and turned toward the forest, her tail no longer wagging but held straight out behind her. Scout moved protectively closer to Bruno, his herding instincts kicking in. But it was Bruno's reaction that made Caleb's breath catch in his throat. The cub's head snapped up at the sound, and for the first time since Caleb had found him, Bruno didn't look like a confused dog trying to fit in. His posture changed completely. His back straightened, his ears moved forward in a way that seemed almost regal, and he let out a small sound that was unmistakably a bear's response. The adult bear called again, this time taking a step forward out of the shadow of the trees. In the full morning light, Caleb could see it was a female, probably around 4 or 5 years old based on her size. Her coat was glossy and well-maintained, suggesting she was healthy and well-fed. Most importantly, she didn't appear aggressive. Her ears weren't flattened back, her mouth wasn't open in a snarl, and she moved with the careful deliberation of an animal trying to communicate rather than threaten. Bruno took a tentative step toward the forest, then stopped and looked back at his dog family. The confusion on his face was heartbreaking. Caleb could almost see the internal struggle playing out in the cub's mind. Here was something that called to a part of him he didn't even know existed, but it meant potentially leaving behind everything and everyone he loved. Rex whimpered softly and moved closer to Bruno, nudging the cub with his nose in a gesture that seemed to say, "Stay with us." Bella joined them, pressing against Bruno's other side, while Scout positioned himself between the cub and the adult bear, his body language protective but not aggressive. The female bear watched this interaction with what Caleb could only describe as curiosity. She tilted her head slightly, studying the unusual group. Then she did something that made Caleb question everything he thought he knew about bear behavior. She sat down. Not the threatening crouch of a predator preparing to attack, but the same casual sitting position Caleb had seen his dogs use thousands of times. She wrapped her tail around her front paws and continued to watch, as if she was simply observing a fascinating puzzle she was trying to solve. Minutes passed in tense silence. Caleb found himself holding his breath, afraid that any sound might shatter whatever delicate balance had been established. The morning seemed to have become unnaturally quiet, as if even the birds and insects were watching this unprecedented encounter. Then Bruno made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of moving toward either the bear or the dogs, he lay down right where he was, in the middle ground between his two worlds. He placed his head on his paws in the same resting position he'd learned from his canine siblings, but his eyes remained fixed on the adult bear. The female bear's response was immediate and unexpected. She lay down as well, mirroring Bruno's position. For several long moments, the two bears simply looked at each other across the distance, while the three dogs maintained their protective stance around Bruno. Caleb realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't a typical predator-prey interaction, or even a territorial dispute. This was communication, recognition, and possibly something even deeper. The adult bear seemed to understand that Bruno was different, that he'd been raised outside the normal bear community, and she was trying to find a way to connect with him without disrupting the bonds he'd already formed. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows across the yard, Caleb noticed something else that made his heart race. The female bear wasn't alone. Movement in the deeper shadows of the forest revealed at least two more shapes, smaller than the female, but larger than Bruno. Cubs, probably from last year's litter, staying back while their mother investigated this strange situation. The realization hit Caleb like a physical blow. This wasn't just any bear. This was likely Bruno's mother, and those were probably his siblings. The family he'd been separated from during that terrible February blizzard had found him. But the story was far more complicated now than a simple reunion. Bruno had been raised by dogs for over 6 months. He thought like a dog, played like a dog, and responded to human commands like a dog. Would his birth family even accept him back? And more importantly, would Bruno want to go back to a world he'd never really known? The female bear seemed to sense Caleb's presence for the first time. She lifted her head and looked directly at him, her dark eyes meeting his across the distance. There was no threat in her gaze, but there was something else that made Caleb's chest tighten with emotion. Recognition, gratitude, and perhaps a question he wasn't sure how to answer. She was thanking him for keeping her cub alive, but she was also asking what came next. The weight of that responsibility settled on Caleb's shoulders like a heavy blanket. He was suddenly the mediator between two families, two species, two completely different ways of life. Bruno seemed to sense the tension in the air. He got to his feet and took a few steps toward his dog family, then turned and looked back at the forest. The cub let out a sound that was part bear moan, part dog whine, expressing confusion that tugged at everyone's heartstrings. Rex, displaying the intelligence that had made him such a good farm dog, seemed to understand what was happening. He walked slowly toward the adult bear, stopping about halfway between Bruno and the forest. The big German shepherd sat down and looked back at Bruno, then at the adult bear, as if he was trying to facilitate some kind of introduction. The female bear watched Rex's approach with careful attention but showed no signs of aggression. When Rex sat down in what was clearly a peaceful gesture, she responded by taking a few steps forward herself, closing the distance between them by half. What happened next would be burned into Caleb's memory forever. Bruno, seeing both his adoptive brother and his birth mother moving toward each other, made a decision that demonstrated just how unique his upbringing had made him. He walked to Rex's side and sat down next to the dog, then looked expectantly at the adult bear as if inviting her to join them. The female bear hesitated for a long moment, clearly unused to this kind of interspecies interaction. But there was something about Bruno's innocent expectation, his complete lack of fear or territorial aggression, that seemed to override her natural caution. Step by careful step, she approached the unlikely pair. When she was about 10 feet away, she stopped and lay down again, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly indicating her willingness to be part of whatever was happening. Bella and Scout, seeing that Rex wasn't in immediate danger, trotted over to join the group. Within minutes, all 5 animals were arranged in a loose circle, with Bruno at the center. The scene was so surreal that Caleb found himself wondering if he was dreaming. 2 bears and 3 dogs, sitting peacefully together in his front yard as if such gatherings were the most natural thing in the world. The only sounds were the normal morning noises of the farm and the occasional soft communication between the animals. But the peaceful moment was about to be shattered by something none of them had anticipated. From the direction of the main road, Caleb heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching. Multiple vehicles moving fast. His stomach dropped as he recognized the distinctive rumble of government trucks and the higher pitch of news vans. Someone had reported the bear sighting, and now his quiet little world was about to be invaded by wildlife officials, reporters, and probably a dozen other people who would want to take Bruno away from the only family he'd ever know. The sound of engines grew louder, and Caleb could see dust clouds rising from the dirt road that led to his property. He had maybe 5 minutes before they arrived. 5 minutes to make a decision that would change everything. His first instinct was to protect Bruno, to somehow hide what had been happening here, but looking at the peaceful gathering in his yard, he realized that might no longer be possible. The female bear seemed to sense the approaching danger as well. Her ears swiveled toward the sound of the vehicles, and her body tensed slightly. But instead of fleeing back to the forest as Caleb expected, she did something that made his heart race with both hope and terror. She moved closer to Bruno, positioning herself between the cub and the direction of the approaching vehicles. Rex, with his years of experience as a guard dog, understood the threat immediately. He stood up and moved to Caleb's side, his body alert but not aggressive. Bella and Scout flanked Bruno on either side, their protective instincts overriding any fear they might have felt about the adult bear's presence. Bruno, caught in the middle of this sudden tension, looked from one face to another, trying to understand what was happening. The approaching sounds were getting louder, and Caleb could now make out the distinctive whine of a news van's engine mixed with the deeper rumble of official vehicles. "They're going to take you away from us," Caleb whispered, kneeling down beside Bruno. The cub nuzzled his hand, still trusting, still innocent of the complications his existence had created. "I should have been more careful. I should have kept you hidden better." But as the first vehicle crested the hill leading to his property, Caleb realized his biggest mistake hadn't been failing to hide Bruno. It had been underestimating how many people had been watching his unusual household. The lead vehicle was a white SUV with the Department of Fish and Wildlife logo on the side, followed closely by a sheriff's patrol car. Behind them came 2 news vans and what looked like several private cars filled with curious onlookers. Word had spread faster than Caleb had ever imagined possible. The female bear's reaction to the convoy was immediate and decisive. She rose to her full height, which was considerably more impressive than Caleb had realized while she was sitting. Standing upright, she was nearly 7 feet tall, her powerful frame casting a long shadow across the yard. But instead of displaying aggression, she did something that left everyone speechless. She moved to stand directly behind Bruno and the 3 dogs, her massive paws placed protectively on either side of the group. Her message was clear. Anyone who wanted to separate this family would have to go through her first. The convoy came to a stop about 30 yards from the house, far enough away to maintain what they probably considered a safe distance from the bears, but close enough for Caleb to see the expressions of shock and confusion on the faces pressed against the windows. Dr. Sarah Martinez stepped out of the lead vehicle first. Caleb recognized her from the local news segments she sometimes did about wildlife conservation. She was the regional supervisor for Fish and Wildlife, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the kind of calm competence that came from years of dealing with dangerous situations. But even Dr. Martinez seemed momentarily stunned by what she was seeing. She stood beside her vehicle for a long moment, speaking quietly into a radio while staring at the unprecedented scene in Caleb's yard. Behind her, Sheriff Tom Bradley emerged from the patrol car. Caleb had known Tom for years, had gone to high school with his younger brother, and had always found him to be a reasonable man, but the expression on Tom's face was one of someone trying to process something that didn't fit into any of his previous experience. The news crews were already setting up their equipment, cameras focusing on the extraordinary gathering of animals. Caleb could hear the excited chatter of reporters preparing their coverage, and he felt a surge of anger at the thought of Bruno becoming a spectacle. "Mr. Hartwell," Dr. Martinez called out, her voice carefully controlled. "We need to talk. We've received reports of an illegal wildlife situation on your property." Caleb looked down at Bruno, who was now pressed against his leg, sensing the tension in the air. The cub's dark eyes were wide with confusion, and Caleb felt his resolve harden. Whatever happened next, he wasn't going to let them traumatize this innocent creature. "There's nothing illegal happening here," Caleb called back, his voice steadier than he felt. "These animals live peacefully together. No one is being harmed." Dr. Martinez took a cautious step forward, her eyes never leaving the adult bear. "Mr. Hartwell, that's a wild black bear standing behind you, and unless I'm mistaken, there's a bear cub that shouldn't be in captivity. This is a very dangerous situation." "Dangerous?" Caleb's voice rose slightly. "The only danger here is from the people who want to tear apart a family that's found a way to live in harmony." The female bear seemed to understand that she was the focus of the humans' concern. In another display of the remarkable intelligence Caleb was coming to recognize, she slowly lowered herself back down to a sitting position, her body language clearly non-threatening, but she remained positioned protectively behind the group. Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his hand resting on his radio but not on his weapon. "Caleb, I've known you since you were a kid. I know you're not trying to cause trouble, but that bear could hurt someone. We need to resolve this situation safely." "She's not going to hurt anyone," Caleb said, surprising himself with his certainty. "She's Bruno's mother. She came here looking for her cub, and when she found him, she saw that he was loved and cared for. Look at her, Tom. Does she look like she wants to attack anyone?" The gathered crowd fell silent as they absorbed this information. The idea that this was a mother bear reuniting with her lost cub changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Several of the reporters began speaking more rapidly into their microphones, updating their stories with this new twist. Dr. Martinez approached more closely, stopping about 15 feet away. At this distance, Caleb could see the conflict in her eyes. She was clearly dealing with a situation that fell far outside normal protocols. "Mr. Hartwell, even if what you're saying is true, we can't allow this to continue. wild bears and domestic dogs don't mix. Someone could get seriously hurt. But they're not wild and domestic anymore, Caleb said, gesturing to the group of animals who were watching the human drama with patient attention. Look at them. They've created something new, something that shouldn't be possible but is happening right in front of your eyes. As if to prove his point, Bruno chose that moment to demonstrate just how integrated he'd become with his dog family. He walked over to Rex and began the grooming behavior he'd learned from the dogs, licking the German Shepherd's ears with the careful attention of a sibling. Rex accepted this treatment with the same patience he'd shown for months, occasionally returning the favor by gently cleaning Bruno's face. The adult female bear watched this interaction with what could only be described as fascination. Her head tilted slightly as she observed her cub behaving in ways that were completely foreign to normal bear behavior, but which clearly brought him happiness and comfort. Dr. Martinez pulled out her phone and began making calls, speaking in low tones to what Caleb assumed were supervisors and experts. While she was occupied, Sheriff Bradley approached more closely. "Caleb, I need you to understand the position this puts everyone in," Tom said quietly. "I've got reporters here, I've got wildlife officials, and I've got what could become a very dangerous situation if that mother bear decides she doesn't like having all these strangers around her cub." "Then maybe everyone should leave," Caleb said. "The situation was perfectly peaceful until you all showed up." Before Tom could respond, something happened that changed everything once again. From the forest behind the adult bear, the two cubs Caleb had glimpsed earlier finally worked up the courage to emerge from the shadows. They were clearly Bruno's siblings, similar in size but different in behavior. Where Bruno moved with the slightly clumsy gait he'd learned from trying to keep up with dogs, these cubs moved with the natural grace of wild bears. The appearance of the two additional bears caused a stir among the crowd. Several people stepped back toward their vehicles, and Caleb heard at least one person suggesting they call an additional backup. But what happened next defied every expectation anyone might have had about bear behavior. The two wild cubs approached their mother and brother cautiously, clearly curious about the strange gathering they'd discovered. When they reached the group, they didn't show any aggression toward the dogs. Instead, they seemed genuinely puzzled by Bruno's behavior. One of the wild cubs, slightly larger than Bruno, approached Rex with obvious caution. The German Shepherd, showing the same remarkable tolerance he'd displayed with Bruno, remained perfectly still, while the wild cub sniffed him thoroughly. After determining that Rex posed no threat, the wild cub actually attempted to play bow, copying a behavior he'd apparently observed Bruno doing with the dogs. The sight of a wild bear cub attempting to play with a domestic dog in front of a crowd of officials and reporters was something none of them had ever imagined witnessing. The second wild cub, emboldened by his siblings' success, approached Bella and Scout with similar curiosity. Dr. Martinez finished her phone calls and rejoined the group, her expression even more conflicted than before. "I've spoken with the regional director and several wildlife behaviorists," she said. "No one has ever encountered a situation like this before. The consensus is that we need to separate the animals immediately, but I'm looking at something that challenges everything we thought we knew about interspecies relationships." "So, don't separate them," Caleb said simply. "Study them instead. Learn from what they've accomplished here." "It's not that simple, Doctor," Martinez replied. "These are wild animals. They belong in the wild, not in someone's backyard." "But Bruno doesn't know he's wild," Caleb pointed out. "He's never lived in the wild. These dogs are his family. This farm is his home. What happens to him if you take him away from everything he's ever known?" The question hung in the air, as everyone contemplated the complexity of the situation. Bruno wasn't just a wild animal that had been captured and needed to be returned to his natural habitat. He was something entirely new. A bear who had been raised as a dog and who had formed bonds that transcended species boundaries. The female bear seemed to sense the tension among the humans. She rose to her feet again and took a step toward Dr. Martinez, causing several people to reach for radios and phones. But instead of showing aggression, she did something that left everyone speechless. She sat down directly in front of Dr. Martinez and tilted her head in what was unmistakably a questioning gesture. The intelligence in her eyes was startling, and for a moment it seemed as though she was trying to communicate directly with the human who held the power to decide her family's fate. Dr. Martinez stared into the bear's eyes for a long moment, and Caleb could see something shift in her expression. The rigid adherence to protocol was giving way to recognition of something unprecedented and precious. "This changes everything," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "They're not just coexisting, they're communicating, they're adapting, they're creating something that shouldn't be possible." But just as it seemed like understanding might prevail, a new complication arrived that threatened to destroy everything they'd built. Racing up the dirt road, throwing up clouds of dust and gravel, came a convoy of black SUVs with government plates that Caleb didn't recognize. These weren't local wildlife officials or county sheriff's deputies. These were federal agents, and their arrival meant the situation was about to become far more serious than anyone had anticipated. The lead SUV screeched to a halt, and out stepped a man in his 40s wearing a dark suit that looked completely out of place on Caleb's rural property. His hair was military short, his posture rigid, and his eyes swept the scene with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to taking control of complicated situations. Behind him emerged 3 more agents, all dressed similarly, all carrying themselves with the same authoritative bearing. One of them was speaking rapidly into a satellite phone, while another was already setting up what looked like sophisticated monitoring equipment. Dr. Martinez turned toward the newcomers, her face showing confusion and growing concern. "I wasn't informed that federal agents would be involved in this situation," she called out. The lead agent approached with measured steps, his eyes never leaving the group of animals. When he spoke, his voice carried the crisp authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "I'm Agent David Morrison, Department of Homeland Security, Biological Threat Assessment Division," he said, producing identification that he held up for everyone to see. "This situation has been classified as a potential biological security risk." Caleb felt his blood run cold. Biological threat? These are just animals living peacefully together. There's no threat here. Agent Morrison's gaze fixed on Caleb with uncomfortable intensity. "Mr. Hartwell, you've been harboring an illegal wild animal for 6 months, during which time it has been in direct contact with domestic animals and humans. We have reason to believe this situation may have created conditions for zoonotic disease transmission or behavioral modification that could affect wildlife populations." "That's ridiculous," Dr. Martinez interjected, though Caleb noticed uncertainty creeping into her voice. "I've been observing this situation for less than an hour, and these animals show no signs of disease or aggressive behavior." "Dr. Martinez, with respect, you're not qualified to assess the full implications of what we're dealing with here," Agent Morrison replied coolly. "This bear cub has been exposed to human habitation, domestic animal pathogens, and artificial behavioral conditioning for an extended period. If released back into the wild population, it could potentially spread diseases or behavioral anomalies that could disrupt entire ecosystems." The words hit Caleb like physical blows. Everything Agent Morrison was saying sounded official and scientific, but it felt wrong, twisted. He looked down at Bruno, who was now pressed against his leg, clearly sensing the new tension in the air, You're talking about him like he's some kind of weapon, Caleb said, his voice rising. He's just a cub who was raised with love and care. Unintended consequences are often the most dangerous kind, Mr. Hartwell, Agent Morrison said. One of my agents will escort you to your house while we assess the situation and determine the best course of action. But before anyone could move, the female bear did something that stopped everyone in their tracks. She had been watching the exchange between the humans with obvious attention, and something about Agent Morrison's aggressive posture and loud voice seemed to trigger her protective instincts. She rose to her full height once again, but this time her body language was different. Her ears were slightly back, her mouth was partially open, showing her impressive teeth, and a low rumble emanated from deep in her chest. She wasn't attacking, but she was clearly issuing a warning. The two wild cubs immediately responded to their mother's signal, moving closer to her and adopting similar alert postures. But Bruno's reaction was completely different and utterly heartbreaking. Instead of joining his birth family in their defensive stance, he moved closer to Rex, Scout, and Bella, seeking comfort from the dogs who had always been his source of safety. Agent Morrison's hand moved toward his jacket, and Caleb caught a glimpse of a holstered weapon. "Everyone needs to step back slowly," the agent said, his voice now carrying real authority. "This situation is becoming dangerous." "She's not dangerous," Caleb shouted. "She's protecting her family. You're the ones making this dangerous." But even as he spoke, Caleb could see how the situation was spiraling out of control. The presence of the federal agents had introduced a level of tension and aggression that hadn't existed before. The mother bear could sense it, the cubs could sense it, and even the dogs were beginning to show signs of stress. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, positioning herself between Agent Morrison and the animals. "Agent Morrison, I need you to lower your voice and step back. You're escalating a situation that was peaceful until your arrival. Dr. Martinez, I'm ordering you to move away from those animals immediately," Agent Morrison replied, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "We have tranquilizer guns in the vehicles, and we're prepared to use them if necessary." The mention of tranquilizer guns sent a wave of panic through Caleb. He'd heard stories about wild animals dying from tranquilizer overdoses, about cubs being separated from their mothers and dying of stress. The thought of Bruno, confused and terrified, being shot with a dart and dragged away from his family was unbearable. But then something extraordinary happened that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Sheriff Bradley, who had been quietly observing the federal agent's arrival, stepped forward and did something that surprised everyone. "Agent Morrison, I'm going to need to see a federal warrant before you take any action on my county's jurisdiction," Tom said, his voice calm but firm. "This is still a local matter until proven otherwise." Agent Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Sheriff, this situation falls under federal authority due to the potential biological security implications." "Maybe so," Tom replied. "But until you show me proper documentation, these animals and this property remain under local protection. Dr. Martinez is the senior wildlife official here, and her assessment takes precedence." Caleb felt a surge of gratitude toward his old friend. Tom was buying them time, creating a bureaucratic obstacle that the federal agents would have to navigate carefully. While the adults argued jurisdiction, something was happening among the animals that none of the humans noticed at first. The two wild cubs, apparently deciding that the humans were too focused on their own conflicts to pay attention, had begun investigating the dogs more thoroughly. The larger of the two wild cubs approached Scout, who was lying down next to Bruno. With typical border collie intelligence, Scout seemed to understand that sudden movements might escalate the human tensions, so he remained perfectly still while the wild cub sniffed him from nose to tail. The wild cub then did something that made Caleb's heart skip a beat. He lay down next to Scout, copying the dog's position exactly. Within moments, his smaller sibling had done the same thing next to Bella. Suddenly, there were 2 wild bear cubs lying peacefully next to 2 domestic dogs, while their mother stood protectively over the entire group, and Bruno sat between his 2 worlds, still confused about where he belonged. One of the news camera operators, apparently deciding this was too good to miss, began filming the unprecedented scene. The image of wild and domestic animals resting together peacefully, while federal agents argued with local officials about jurisdiction, was going to be broadcast around the world within hours. Agent Morrison noticed the camera, and his expression darkened further. This situation is now a matter of national security. All recording devices need to be turned off immediately. But the news crews had been recording since they arrived, and the footage was already being transmitted back to their stations. Within minutes, social media began exploding with videos and images of the remarkable scene unfolding on Caleb's farm. Dr. Martinez pulled out her phone and quickly scrolled through the rapidly spreading posts. "Agent Morrison, you need to see this," she said, holding up her phone. "This story is going viral. Whatever we do here is going to be seen by millions of people." The agent glanced at the phone screen, and Caleb could see frustration flash across his face. Public attention was clearly the last thing he wanted in this situation. "All the more reason to resolve this quickly and decisively," Agent Morrison said. "We can't allow sentiment to override scientific necessity." But then, Dr. Martinez received a phone call that changed everything once again. She answered with her official greeting, then listened for several minutes, her expression growing more surprised with each passing moment. "I understand," she finally said. "Yes, I'll inform everyone immediately." She hung up and turned to address the entire group, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and disbelief. That was Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the National Wildlife Research Institute, she announced. She's been monitoring the social media coverage of this situation, and she's convinced her department to authorize an emergency research protocol. Agent Morrison's face showed immediate suspicion. What kind of research protocol? Instead of separating these animals, Dr. Rodriguez wants to study them, Dr. Martinez explained. She says this could be the most significant interspecies behavioral study in decades. The National Wildlife Research Institute is prepared to send a full team here to document and analyze what's happening. Caleb felt a spark of hope. Research meant time, and time meant Bruno and his unusual family might have a chance to stay together, but Agent Morrison's reaction was swift and negative. "Absolutely not. These animals pose a potential biological threat that supersedes any research value they might have." "Agent Morrison," Dr. Martinez said, her voice taking on a steely edge. "Dr. Rodriguez has federal authority that equals yours. The National Wildlife Research Institute is a Department of Interior agency, and wildlife falls under their jurisdiction, not Homeland Security's." The jurisdictional standoff was becoming more complex by the minute, but Caleb could see that public attention was working in their favor. The longer this situation remained in the spotlight, the harder it would be for anyone to make Bruno and his family simply disappear. However, just as it seemed like the research protocol might provide a solution, a new crisis emerged that threatened to destroy everything. One of Agent Morrison's subordinates, who had been setting up monitoring equipment, suddenly called out in alarm. "Sir, we're picking up multiple heat signatures moving through the forest," the agent reported, staring at a tablet displaying what looked like thermal imaging. At least 6 large animals, possibly more, approaching from 3 different directions. Everyone turned toward the forest, and Caleb felt his stomach drop as he realized what was happening. The presence of the mother bear and her cubs, combined with all the human activity and noise, had attracted other bears to the area. The peaceful gathering that had seemed so remarkable just minutes before was about to become something far more dangerous and unpredictable. And Bruno, caught in the middle of it all, was about to face the most challenging test of his confused identity yet. The thermal imaging tablet showed the approaching heat signatures moving through the dense forest with purpose, not the random wandering of animals searching for food. Agent Morrison's subordinate, Agent Parks, continued his urgent report while staring at the screen. "Sir, the signatures are moving in coordinated patterns. 3 from the North Ridge, 2 from the eastern slope, and at least 1 more from the southern boundary. They're all converging on this location." Dr. Martinez grabbed her radio and quickly switched to the emergency wildlife frequency. "This is Dr. Martinez requesting immediate backup from all available wildlife units. We have a potential multi-bear situation developing at the Hartwell property." The mother bear seemed to sense the approaching danger before any of the humans did. Her massive head turned toward the forest, and she let out a series of low vocalizations that Caleb had never heard before. They weren't the soft, communicative sounds she'd been making earlier, but something deeper, more urgent. The 2 wild cubs immediately responded to their mother's calls, abandoning their peaceful positions next to the dogs and moving to flank her on either side. Their playful demeanor vanished, replaced by the alert wariness of wild animals preparing for a potential threat. But Bruno's reaction was completely different and heartbreaking to witness. Instead of joining his birth family in their defensive formation, he moved closer to Rex and began making the same distressed whimpering sounds he'd made as a tiny cub when he'd first arrived at the farm. The dogs immediately surrounded him protectively, their own instincts telling them that something was wrong. "We need to evacuate everyone immediately," Agent Morrison said, his earlier bureaucratic concerns suddenly replaced by practical urgency. "If we're dealing with multiple aggressive bears, this situation is about to become lethal." Sheriff Bradley was already on his radio, calling for additional units and emergency medical backup. The news crews, finally understanding that they might be in real danger, began hastily packing their equipment and retreating toward their vehicles. But Dr. Martinez held up her hand, studying the scene with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades working with wild animals. "Wait," she said, her voice carrying a note of puzzlement. "Look at the mother bear's body language. She's alert, but she's not showing fear or aggression. She's expectant." Caleb followed Dr. Martinez's gaze and realized she was right. The female bear wasn't preparing to defend her cubs against an attack. She was positioning herself as if she was waiting for something or someone she recognized. The first of the approaching bears emerged from the tree line about 50 yards away, and Caleb's breath caught in his throat. It was an enormous male, easily twice the size of the female, with scars across his muzzle that spoke of years of dominance battles. This was clearly an alpha bear, and his presence changed the entire dynamic of the situation. But instead of charging toward the gathering or displaying territorial aggression, the big male stopped at the forest's edge and sat down. His massive head turned toward the female bear, and he let out a low, rumbling call that seemed almost respectful. Within minutes, the other approaching bears had emerged from various points around the property's perimeter. There were 6 in total: the big male, a smaller male that was probably a younger adult, and 4 females of various ages. Instead of forming an attacking formation, they arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around the property, all maintaining a respectful distance from the central gathering. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Martinez whispered, her scientific training warring with the evidence of her own eyes. "Bears don't gather like this. They're solitary animals except during mating season or when there's abundant food. This is unprecedented. Agent Morrison was clearly struggling to process what he was witnessing. His training had prepared him for biological threats, aggressive wildlife, and security risks. It hadn't prepared him for what appeared to be some kind of interspecies diplomatic gathering. Could they be here because of the cub? Sheriff Bradley asked, voicing the question everyone was thinking. Dr. Martinez nodded slowly. It's possible. If word has spread through the local bear population about the unusual situation here, they might be curious. Bears are much more intelligent than most people realize. The big male bear seemed to have heard their conversation. He rose to his feet and began walking slowly toward the central group, his movements careful and deliberate. With each step, the tension among the humans increased exponentially. "Nobody move," Agent Morrison hissed, his hand now openly resting on his weapon. "If that bear charges, we won't have time to react." But the big male's intentions became clear as he approached. He stopped about 20 feet away from the mother bear and her cubs, lowered his massive head in what could only be described as a respectful greeting, and then did something that left everyone speechless. He lay down. Not the aggressive crouch of a predator, not the alert position of a territorial animal, but the same relaxed, lying position that the dogs and younger bears had been using. The message was unmistakable. He was acknowledging the gathering as peaceful and choosing to participate rather than disrupt. One by one, the other bears around the perimeter began moving closer, each stopping at a respectful distance and lowering themselves to the ground. Within 15 minutes, Caleb's front yard had been transformed into something that looked like the most unusual peace summit in natural history. Bruno, who had been watching these developments with wide-eyed confusion, suddenly seemed to make a decision that surprised everyone. He left the safety of his dog family and began walking toward the big male bear. "Bruno, no!" Caleb called out, starting to move toward the cub, but Dr. Martinez caught his arm. "Wait," she said softly. "Let's see what happens." The approach of the small cub toward the enormous male should have been terrifying to watch. But instead of showing aggression or even interest, the big male remained perfectly still, allowing Bruno to approach at his own pace. When Bruno reached the male, something extraordinary happened. The cub began exhibiting behaviors that were clearly learned from the dogs, sniffing the male's face, trying to lick his ears, and even attempting to initiate play by pawing at the bear's massive front leg. The big male's reaction was gentle and patient. He allowed the unusual greeting, occasionally responding with soft vocalizations that seemed designed to reassure rather than intimidate. After several minutes of this interaction, Bruno did something that brought tears to Caleb's eyes. The cub turned back toward the dogs and began making the same soft calling sounds his mother had been using, as if he was trying to introduce his two families to each other. Rex, displaying the courage and intelligence that had made him such a remarkable companion, actually responded to Bruno's call. The German shepherd rose to his feet and began walking slowly toward the gathering of bears, his body language calm but alert. "This is insane," Agent Morrison muttered, but even he seemed mesmerized by what was unfolding. Rex reached Bruno's side and sat down next to the cub, facing the big male bear. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the dog and the massive bear regarded each other across a species divide that should have been unbridgeable. Then the big male did something that would be replayed on news channels around the world for weeks to come. He lowered his enormous head and gently touched noses with Rex, in a gesture of greeting that transcended every boundary between wild and domestic, predator and prey. Bella and Scout, emboldened by Rex's success, trotted over to join the group. Within minutes, Bruno was sitting in the center of a circle that included 3 dogs, 8 bears of various ages and sizes, and a growing crowd of humans who were documenting something that wildlife experts would study for decades. But the peaceful tableau was about to be shattered by a development that none of them had anticipated. Dr. Martinez's radio crackled to life with an urgent transmission that made her face go pale. "Dr. Martinez, this is Base Command. We're receiving reports of unusual bear behavior across a 50-mile radius of your location. Multiple sightings of bears traveling toward your coordinates from every direction. Estimated numbers are significant." She grabbed the radio with shaking hands. "Base Command, please clarify. How many bears are we talking about?" The response sent a chill through everyone who heard it. "Current reports suggest somewhere between 30 and 50 individual bears, all converging on your location. Dr. Martinez, whatever is happening there has triggered the largest recorded bear gathering in North American history." Caleb felt the weight of that information settle on his shoulders like a crushing burden. Bruno wasn't just connecting with his immediate family anymore. Somehow, the cub's unique existence had called to every bear in the region, creating a situation that was unprecedented in wildlife history. Agent Morrison was already on his satellite phone, speaking rapidly to his superiors and requesting immediate backup. Sheriff Bradley was coordinating with state police and emergency services. The news crews, despite the potential danger, were reporting live to a global audience that was watching in fascination and growing concern. But in the center of all this chaos, Bruno remained blissfully unaware of the magnitude of what his existence had triggered. He was simply happy to be surrounded by both of his families, playing with the dogs while the bears watched with what could only be described as protective approval. Dr. Martinez approached Caleb, her expression grave. "Mr. Hartwell, I need you to understand what we're dealing with here. If 50 bears converge on this location, we won't be able to control the situation. This could become dangerous not just for us, but for every bear involved." "What are you saying?" Caleb asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. "I'm saying that Bruno may have inadvertently triggered something that could end in tragedy for everyone involved," she replied. "We need to find a way to disperse this gathering before it becomes unmanageable." But even as she spoke, they could hear the sounds of more bears approaching through the forest. The largest wildlife gathering in recorded history was converging on Caleb's small farm, all because of one confused bear cub who thought he was a dog. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the sound of approaching vehicles and gathering bears, Caleb could hear something that made his blood run cold. The sound of helicopters, growing louder by the minute, carrying what he feared would be a military response to a situation that had grown far beyond anyone's ability to control. The peaceful morning that had started with a simple game of fetch was about to become a confrontation that would determine not just Bruno's fate, but potentially the future of human-wildlife relationships across the entire region. And at the center of it all was a small bear cub whose only crime had been loving a family that happened to be a different species than his own. The sound of helicopters grew louder, and within minutes, 3 military choppers appeared over the horizon, their rotors creating a thunderous noise that sent vibrations through the ground. The bears in the gathering immediately became alert, their ears swiveling toward the sky, but remarkably none of them fled. Instead, they seemed to close ranks around Bruno and the dogs, as if protecting them from this new aerial threat. Agent Morrison received a call on his satellite phone, his face growing grimmer with each word he heard. When he hung up, he turned to address the gathered officials with obvious reluctance. "That was my director. The Department of Defense has been monitoring this situation via satellite. The concentration of wildlife here is being classified as a potential biological anomaly that requires immediate investigation and containment. Containment? Caleb stepped forward, his voice rising above the helicopter noise. These animals aren't weapons or diseases. They're families trying to be together. Mr. Hartwell, I understand your emotional attachment to the situation, Agent Morrison replied. But we're looking at unprecedented animal behavior that could indicate everything from environmental contamination to disease transmission to some form of biological experimentation. Dr. Martinez pulled Agent Morrison aside, speaking urgently into his ear. Caleb couldn't hear their conversation over the helicopter noise, but he could see the increasing tension in both their faces. Meanwhile, more bears continued to emerge from the forest. The gathering now included at least 15 individuals, ranging from cubs barely older than Bruno to massive adults that dwarfed even the alpha male. But instead of creating chaos, each new arrival seemed to understand the peaceful nature of the gathering, and found a spot in the expanding circle around Bruno and his unusual family. Sheriff Bradley approached Caleb, his expression troubled. Caleb, I've got state police setting up roadblocks 3 miles out in every direction. The governor's office is calling this an emergency wildlife situation, and they're talking about evacuating the entire area. Tom, you've seen what's happening here, Caleb pleaded. These bears aren't aggressive. They're curious, maybe even protective, but they're not dangerous. I know what I've seen, Tom replied, but I also know what happens when politicians and federal agents get scared. They start making decisions based on worst-case scenarios instead of what's actually happening. The lead helicopter began circling lower, and Caleb could see figures in hazmat suits preparing equipment that looked far more serious than tranquilizer guns. His heart sank as he realized they were preparing for what they considered a biological containment operation. But then, something happened that changed the entire dynamic once again. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the researcher from the National Wildlife Research Institute who had been monitoring the situation remotely, arrived in a convoy of vehicles that included mobile research labs and communication equipment. Dr. Rodriguez was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. She stepped out of her vehicle and surveyed the scene with the trained eye of someone who had spent her entire career studying animal behavior. "Agent Morrison," she called out, her voice carrying easily over the noise. "I'm invoking Emergency Research Authority under the Wildlife Protection and Scientific Study Act. This gathering is now under the protection of federal research protocols." Agent Morrison's face showed immediate frustration. "Dr. Rodriguez, this situation has already been classified as a potential security threat. Research protocols don't supersede security concerns." "Actually, they do," Dr. Rodriguez replied, producing documentation from her briefcase. "When dealing with unprecedented wildlife behavior that could advance scientific understanding, research authority takes precedence. I've already spoken with both our department's directors." The jurisdictional battle was becoming increasingly complex, but Caleb could see that Dr. Rodriguez's arrival had bought them precious time. Her research team was already setting up equipment to document and study the gathering, treating it as a historic scientific opportunity rather than a threat to be eliminated. One of Dr. Rodriguez's assistants, a young man with multiple cameras and recording devices, approached the bear gathering with careful, respectful movements. The bears watched him warily, but allowed him to position himself close enough to capture detailed footage of their interactions. What the cameras recorded over the next hour would revolutionize scientific understanding of animal intelligence and cross-species communication. The bears weren't just tolerating each other's presence, they were actively communicating through a complex system of vocalizations, body language, and even what appeared to be deliberate positioning. Bruno, oblivious to his role as the catalyst for this historic gathering, continued to move freely between the bears and dogs, serving as a bridge between two worlds. But as the cameras rolled, it became clear that he was doing more than just facilitating introductions. The cub seemed to be teaching the wild bears about dog behavior, demonstrating play techniques, grooming methods, and even basic commands he'd learned from Caleb. More remarkably, some of the bears were actually attempting to copy these behaviors, creating the first documented case of wild animals voluntarily adopting domestic animal behaviors. Dr. Rodriguez watched the footage on a monitor, her excitement barely contained. "This is extraordinary," she whispered to her assistant. "We're witnessing the emergence of a new form of interspecies communication. That cub is acting as a cultural bridge between two completely different animal societies." But the peaceful research atmosphere was shattered when one of the military helicopters landed in Caleb's back pasture, disgorging a team of soldiers in full biological protection gear. Their leader, a colonel whose nameplate read Harrison, approached Agent Morrison with obvious urgency. "Agent Morrison, we've received intelligence that this situation may not be as natural as it appears," Colonel Harrison said, his voice muffled by his protective mask. "Satellite analysis has detected unusual electromagnetic signatures in this area, and there are reports of similar animal gatherings occurring simultaneously in 3 other locations across North America." Dr. Martinez looked up sharply from her monitoring equipment. "Other locations? What kind of gatherings?" "Wolf packs in Canada exhibiting unprecedented cooperative behavior with domestic dogs, dolphin pods in California showing organized interaction with whale populations, and a massive bird migration convergence in Mexico that's defying every known pattern," Colonel Harrison replied. "Whatever is happening here isn't isolated." The implications of this information sent shockwaves through the gathered officials. If Bruno's situation was part of a larger phenomenon affecting wildlife across the continent, the stakes were far higher than anyone had imagined. Dr. Rodriguez immediately began making calls to research stations across North America, trying to coordinate information about these other incidents. Meanwhile, Agent Morrison was receiving increasingly urgent instructions from his superiors to contain the situation before it could spread further. But as the adults argued and planned, Bruno was creating a moment that would be remembered as one of the most remarkable displays of animal intelligence ever recorded. The cub had apparently decided that his 2 families needed to work together more closely. He began a complex series of movements and vocalizations that seemed designed to encourage specific interactions between the bears and dogs. He would approach one of the wild bears, demonstrate a particular behavior he'd learned from the dogs, then guide that bear toward one of his canine siblings. The result was unprecedented. Within an hour, Caleb's front yard hosted scenes that shouldn't have been possible. A massive male bear carefully grooming Rex's fur, while the German Shepherd patiently accepted the attention. 2 female bears engaging in a gentle tug-of-war game, with Bella using a fallen branch, and Scout attempting to herd a group of younger bears who seemed to enjoy the game immensely. The footage of these interactions was being broadcast live to research institutions around the world, where animal behaviorists were struggling to explain what they were witnessing. Traditional theories about territorial behavior, species barriers, and survival instincts were being challenged by the reality unfolding on Caleb's farm. But the peaceful research environment was about to be disrupted by news that would escalate the situation beyond anyone's ability to control. Dr. Rodriguez received a call that made her face go white with shock. "Dr. Martinez, Agent Morrison, you need to hear this," she said, putting her phone on speaker. That was the International Wildlife Monitoring Station. They're receiving reports of unusual animal behavior from research stations on 6 continents. This isn't just a North American phenomenon. Something is triggering unprecedented interspecies cooperation around the globe. The silence that followed this announcement was broken only by the sound of helicopters overhead and the gentle interactions continuing between the bears and dogs. Everyone present suddenly understood that they weren't just dealing with one unusual bear cub anymore. They were potentially witnessing the beginning of a fundamental shift in animal behavior patterns worldwide, and Bruno was somehow at the center of it all. The small cub, who had been raised by dogs, wasn't just bridging the gap between two species. He might be catalyzing a transformation in how animals related to each other across the planet. But, as this realization sank in, a new sound reached them from the forest that made everyone's blood run cold. It was the deep, primal roar of something much larger than any bear they'd encountered so far. From the darkness of the deep woods came a call that spoke of ancient power and territorial dominance that hadn't been challenged in decades. The bears in the gathering immediately responded to this new presence, their relaxed postures shifting to alert attention. Even the massive alpha male raised his head and let out a responding call that carried both respect and caution. Bruno, still innocent of the complex dynamics he'd unleashed, simply tilted his head curiously at the new sound and took a step toward the forest, as if he wanted to invite this newcomer to join their peaceful gathering. But Caleb, looking at the sudden tension in every bear present, realized that whatever was approaching from the deep woods was something even these powerful animals treated with extraordinary respect. And it was coming directly toward their unprecedented gathering, drawn by the same mysterious force that had brought together the largest assembly of wildlife in recorded history.